All right. So last week we finished off. What? Yep. Last week we finished off with looking at Judas Iscariot. As we are down to there's Judas Iscariot, and then James, the son of Alphaeus, is going to be the last apostle that we look at. Well, and then Paul as well. We haven't done Paul yet, but we'll look at Paul as well at the end. So we discussed half of Judas Iscariot last week, and we'll discuss the other half this week. And as we noted in John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, that when Mary Magdalene is using this expensive oil to anoint Jesus, Judas Iscariot gets pretty upset because, hey, this could have been sold and the proceeds used to help the poor. And then what John tells us is that Judas had no real concern about the poor at all. In fact, he was the holder of the money bag or the money box. He was, in essence, the treasurer, and he was stealing money. And presumably nobody, obviously except Jesus, nobody knew that he was involved in doing that at the time. And so his real motive was, in fact, that he was wishful that they had sold it so that he could have maybe stolen some of those funds as well. But it was after this, and of course we talked a little bit last week about Judas Iscariot's motivations and his character. And I hope this font works. But they updated my app on this thing, and it changed it all up, and I don't like it. But starting in verse 9, so at the end of verse 8, Jesus, of course, he focuses on the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always. But then in verse 9, now a great many of the Jews knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Remember, this was widely known that Lazarus had died. He was dead for several days, and to the point that he was stinking, and so it was well known that he had died. And then this miracle that had been done about Lazarus being raised then spread far and wide. So this was not something that was done in a corner, as Paul would tell Agrippa. This was something that was widely known. And so in verse 10, the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. Now, what's interesting is when we combine that with our other accounts in Matthew 26 and in Mark 14, we find that it was after this, that's when Judas actively started seeking the potential to betray Jesus. Now, again, whether or not he had a full understanding of what the end result was going to be, or that he did care to the extent that, as we'll talk about here in a minute, he did have remorse. But with regard to his effort to at least receive money for the purpose of betraying Jesus, I think Judas Iscariot was an opportunist for sure. He was greedy, and when opportunity meets ability, then you have this situation that takes place. Because the Jews, the leaders of the Jews, the Sanhedrin, were so desperate to get a hold of Jesus. And remember, it wasn't just Jesus they wanted to kill. They wanted to kill Lazarus too. They wanted to eliminate the evidence. So they were so desperate to kill Jesus, that created an opportunity for Judas to come along and say, okay, well, I know you're really, really wanting him right now. How much are you willing to pay? And so it was kind of like the right time, right moment. Judas had this opportunity. And of course, this plan was concocted over a period of time. But then we find in Luke chapter 22 and in John chapter 13 that it was on the Passover, after the Passover dinner, the Passover meal on Thursday evening, that Jesus basically has to say to Judas, what you're going to do, do it. If you're gonna do what you're gonna do it. But Judas says Satan entered Judas in John 13 or in Luke chapter 22 verses 1 through 6. And of course we talk about the fact that some people take that to mean that Judas didn't have a choice. He didn't have any any recourse. He had to, he was forced to. When in fact we're told that Judas has been planning this all this time. But now his course is set. Now he has determined that that's what he's going to do. And the idea of Satan entering him is the yielding or the giving in to that influence. That temptation was there. And it's possible that Judas was kind of going back and forth as to whether or not he actually was going to go through with it. It's possible that Judas maybe was having second thoughts, or that maybe, I'm not real sure if I'm going to do this or not. But then he had made the decision, and then Jesus says, if you're going to do it, do it. What you're going to do, go do. And so then Judas leaves and goes betrays Jesus. But it is interesting that you kind of have that acknowledgement that at that point, Judas had made up his mind. Okay? At that point, he committed himself to betraying Jesus. And of course, we talk about the fact that Judas was given every opportunity to not do that. Okay, it wasn't like Jesus commanded him to. Although, as we note at the end of our notes, there's a so-called Gospel of Judas. It was actually written in the late 100s, early 200s A.D. But it's a Gnostic document. But what it claims is that Judas knew all along, and that he was commanded by Jesus to betray him, which is not the truth. And so the understanding that Judas has already made these plans, now it's just where's the opportunity, when's going to be the best time to do it, and so forth, and now he's committed to that. That's why Jesus says, if you're going to do whatever you're going to do it. And so that's why he goes. And then in Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 47, as well as in John chapter 18, we see, we'll go ahead and look at the John chapter 18, where Judas comes and betrays Jesus. Verse 2, and Judas who betrayed him also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. They were in Gethsemane. And so in verse 3, then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, whom are you seeking? And they answered, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to them, I am he. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with him. And of course, the fact that Jesus says, I am, they drew back, they fell to the ground. And then, of course, we see Simon Peter getting into a thing. So what John records is, of course, the fact that Judas leads them out there. He doesn't record what we call the Judas kiss. It's often referenced, the Judas kiss. It's a phrase representing betrayal. But what is interesting with this is the fact that there's a couple of things. The fact that they didn't know where Jesus was, for one thing. Judas had to take them there. Okay, so during this process, and of course, especially with Passover and everything, they didn't have a spy on Jesus or anything like that. It's not like they knew where he was all the time. There wasn't GPS or anything. And so Judas had to show them where they were. It wasn't like Jesus and the apostles were hiding necessarily, but they were out in Gethsemane. Remember, Jesus is kind of a isolated place. But then the fact that Judas has to kiss Jesus to show that this is the one. Okay, so the individuals that are with Judas, they don't know specifically either what Jesus looks like, or the fact that given that it is dark, it's not like they have street lamps, all they have is torches. Maybe they just wouldn't be able to see him well in the night. And so the fact that Judas goes and kisses Jesus gives them the information they need. That's the one we're after. But regardless, again, at this point, and for instance, Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 47, 26 verse 47, scroll down. Verse 47, and while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer had given them a sign, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him. Immediately he went up to Jesus and said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. But Jesus said to him, friend, why have you come? And they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. And of course, Peter again does his thing there in verse 51. But what's interesting here is there seems to be a bit of dialogue that between the four Gospels, or at least between the three Gospels, we kind of have a little bit broader sense that there is a little bit more dialogue here. So Judas, again, in John, doesn't record the kiss. It says Judas is with them. They come to arrest Jesus. Here, we're told that Judas embraces Jesus, gives him a kiss, and says, "Greetings, Rabbi," okay, and kisses him. And then Jesus responds, "Friend, why have you come?" And I think that's interesting that Jesus says that. Obviously, Jesus knows why he came, but he calls him friend. And of course, for the last 3 years, he was supposed to have been a friend. And they were, as I said, over those 3 years, they became basically like a family. But the fact is that at this point, obviously, Jesus knows he has betrayed him. But then in Mark chapter 14, let's see. So Mark chapter 14, there's a little bit of background here about how they were going to grab Jesus. The thought process was not during Passover because the people would be in an uproar. And remember, just a couple of days earlier when Jesus entered Jerusalem, how did the people of Jerusalem greet him? Yeah, they were glorifying and praising God. They were laying down palm branches as he was riding in on a donkey. And so obviously the Sanhedrin were a little hesitant regarding the timing of how they were going to take Jesus. But then, so again, this records the Judas and the betrayal of Jesus. So after that situation with the spikenard or the oil, then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. So he sought how he might conveniently betray him. So there's a period of time after the resurrection of Lazarus. It's during that period of time that Judas is trying to figure out how and when can I betray Jesus. So then going down to verse, no, not 15. Oh, come on. See, this app is just down to verse 43 of Mark 14. Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely." As soon as he'd come, immediately he went up to him and said to him, "Rabbi, Rabbi," and kissed him. And then they laid their hands on him and took him, and one of those who stood by drew his sword, and that would be Peter. The other account that we have is in Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, and in verse 47. I wish there was an easy way to scroll this down. There's not. Oh, come on. Come on. Starting in verse 47, while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before him and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" And when those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" Peter went ahead and did it anyway, as was Peter's kind of attitude, and so forth. So, but what's interesting about this is you see kind of a combination of, between the different accounts, a fuller sense that there was a little bit more dialogue. Okay, when Judas comes up, he says, "Greetings, Rabbi," and "Rabbi, Rabbi." He kisses him, and then at some point, Jesus, either before or after the kiss, he says, "Friend, why have you come?" And then after he kisses him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" So all of that dialogue is there, and presumably, it's interesting. Where are the soldiers and the individuals that Judas has brought? Are they hiding in the bushes? Are they kind of holding back and then they rush in? Or are they all standing there together? But remember, at a certain point, they're all there because Jesus says, "Who are you seeking?" And Jesus of Nazareth. And when Jesus says, "I am," they kind of fall backwards because Jesus makes a statement that links him to being Jehovah. So it's interesting to kind of notice how all of these accounts link together and help us to form a bigger picture of what that scene was like, and also gives us a little bit of an idea of kind of that relationship between Jesus and Judas. Again, Jesus calls him friend and then calls him by name. So Judas, are you betraying the Son of God with a kiss? But ultimately, that is how how Judas identified Jesus. And of course, what was the significance or what was the purpose of using a kiss? What was the purpose of that? Okay. In fact, in some places in this world, it's still normal, isn't it? Such as France, okay, in Europe. A lot of times they kiss both sides of the cheek. Okay, that's a common greeting. Sometimes it's also used as a farewell or a goodbye. It doesn't have any kind of romantic inclinations or implications. It doesn't have any type of anything like that. It's like shaking hands. That's thus the greet one another with a holy kiss. Okay, it's a greeting. In our society, we shake hands. In their society, they kiss on the cheek. Okay, but what's interesting here is the fact that Judas uses something, first of all, that is meant to be a friendly and warm greeting as the means of identifying the one that he's betraying. And that's why the phrase a Judas kiss, or some people just shorten it to you Judas, to reference or identify that contrast, that here you are supposed to be my friend, and he's supposed to be a disciple of Jesus, an apostle, and he is part of that ministry, and yet he uses a kiss, which is meant to convey this greeting, this warm greeting of friendship and warmth. He uses that to identify Jesus to betray him. And so that obviously that contrast there is part of what kind of makes it such a I guess kind of stuck in the mind of even people who aren't Christians, or even for that matter religious, often use the phrase you Judas or Judas kiss, because it's that ingrained into the kind of the social mind, I guess you could say. Thoughts or comments through that? So then we see Judas was remorseful, but he did not handle his failure properly. In Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 3, we note how that after Jesus was taken, Judas it's almost as if he's surprised. Now, why he's surprised, other than the fact that maybe he thought that Jesus was going to get out of this somehow, like he had always done. That's kind of the way I lean in terms of thinking, that Judas really didn't intend for Jesus to actually be killed. That he didn't think that was actually what was going to happen. It's also possible that he just had a change of heart. Once he realized maybe what he had done, that for 30 pieces of silver he had betrayed the Son of God, and now the Son of God, the Messiah, is going to be put to death. I've ruined God's plan. I've ruined... if Judas truly did believe he was the Messiah, and I have no reason to think he didn't, and remember, even all the apostles still had this thought process. It was a physical kingdom, a physical Messiah, and now he's going to die. I have single-handedly derailed God's prophecies and plan. So it's one of the two, because what we find in verse 3, then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, he was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? You see to it. So it's interesting that Judas, first of all, acknowledges, that Jesus is what? He's innocent. Okay, I have betrayed innocent blood. All right. So first of all, Jesus isn't guilty. Okay, not only is he not guilty of any crime worthy of being put to death, but he's not guilty of any sin either. But it is important to note that this does mean, or I believe this implies, that Judas does believe Jesus is the Messiah. Because one of the, at least, reasons why the Jews claimed that they wanted to kill Jesus was really two main reasons. One, because he was a threat against their desire for that physical kingdom and that physical Messiah. But ultimately, he's profaning and casting himself as God. He's profaning the law of Moses. But also he's setting himself up as king, and only Caesar's our king, is what they're going to tell Pilate. And neither one of those, at least as far as what Judas says here in verse 4, seems to have any kind of a meaning to him in terms of guilt on Jesus. Jesus wasn't claiming to be a king like Caesar, okay, of a physical kingdom, first of all. And second of all, in Jesus's references to himself and the Father and the fact that he was the Son of God and so forth, that wasn't blasphemy. I don't think Judas believed it was blasphemy, which suggests that Judas did believe Jesus was the Son of God. But having said that, again, one of two things here is going on. Either A, he really didn't think that it would work. He thought it would be basically an easy payday. I'll get the 30 pieces of silver, I'll betray Jesus, and then Jesus will just kind of vanish or do whatever it is he had done before and get out of it, and nothing will happen. It'll all be fine. And then I guess, I don't know if Judas thought that, he'd retire somewhere on 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver wasn't very much. Or maybe he thought, I'll just ask Jesus to forgive me, I'm so sorry. Or maybe he thought maybe he wouldn't know. Again, the thought process here is, depending on how all this took place, it may very well have been that the soldiers were kind of back a ways. And then when Judas kisses Jesus, then the soldiers come out. It's possible that Judas could have played off as being completely, oh, what's going on? Where did they come from? Oh no, how did this happen? Of course, Jesus knew, and that's why Jesus says, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? But it's possible that he was just going to play it off as, oh, I can't believe they found us. How did they do that? So maybe he was thinking he would just kind of ride back in with the rest of the apostles like everything was fine and nobody would know the better. Still, that leaves one to think, okay, well, Judas, if you really believe Jesus is the Son of God, what makes you think that you can trick him like that? But again, this is, who knows what Judas is thinking here. The other aspect of it is, like I said, maybe Judas, it just hit him. Now he's set for death. He's been condemned and he's going to be put to death. There is no other possible scenario here. Regardless of what the Romans said, regardless of what Pilate said, is there any thought that the Sanhedrin wouldn't rile up the people enough to be able to put him to death? No. They're still going to put him to death with or without the Romans' consent. But it's possible that Judas, it simply hit him that I've betrayed the Messiah. I can't believe I did. What am I doing? What have I done? And now the whole plan of God is ruined. Not only for myself, but for Israel. I've ruined the plan of God. But regardless, what we see is in verse 5, he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. Now what's interesting about this is the fact that the Sanhedrin wouldn't take the money back. No, that's blood money. We don't want it back. We paid you and that transaction's done. It's yours. So he goes to the temple. He throws the silver in the temple. And then he went and then he hung himself. And the chief priests, they take the silver and they say it's not lawful to put them into the treasury because they're the price of blood. They know, all of Jerusalem knows what's happening. Again, this is not taking place in a corner. All of this is out in the open and people know what's going on. Okay, even the priests being aware of where this money came from and what it ultimately was. It was blood money. And so we can't put this in the treasury of the temple. So what are we going to do with it? So, verse 7, they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. And so that understanding that they bought this field particularly for foreigners. It says strangers, that's particularly for foreigners or those who were very poor and couldn't afford a tomb to be placed in. Okay, so those who were foreigners who died and there was no family to claim them or take them back home, or for people who were very poor, usually, I guess it could have been used for criminals, although typically criminals there was very little for criminals whatsoever, very little allowance for them at all to be buried for in any particular place. Just, dig a hole and put them in it type of thing. It's possible that they would have used that for criminals as well. But then in verse 9, Matthew tells us it was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. And so notice the prophecy attached to this, because that's very important, actually, to note that there was a prophecy, that Matthew connects this prophecy with the events that take place with Judas. Okay, but then Judas goes and hangs himself. Okay, so he kills himself. Now, what we find, first of all, is that there's a stark contrast between how Judas handles failure or sin, as he himself says, I've sinned by betraying innocent blood. That's not the only way he sinned. Obviously, there was greed involved and stealing from the box and so forth. But there's a stark contrast between Judas's example and Peter's example. Because remember, at the trial, Peter's going to deny Jesus 3 times. Now, Peter didn't walk up and kiss him on the cheek and betray him in that way. But in his own way, Peter did betray Jesus 3 times more than Judas did. Okay? Yet Judas decided to kill himself, whereas Peter, he was able to pick course. Again, this was with the understanding that Jesus had told him beforehand, you're going to deny me 3 times. But once you have returned, okay, you need to strengthen your brethren. And so Peter, the way he handles it, I'm sure was full of remorse as well. But there was a penitent heart seeking to make it right and to change. There was no repentance here from Judas. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to handle it. There was no repentance. In fact, that again suggests that for all intents and purposes, this is the end. This is the end of everything. I have destroyed the plan of God, and that's it. It's all over. So I might as well kill myself. And that's what he did. Well, and it does speak to, first of all, again, despite the fact that even the apostles still had this physical kingdom mindset, did they go off and kill themselves after Jesus was crucified? Okay, they had to go from Thursday night, Friday, and Saturday into Sunday morning until Jesus was raised. So for those 3 days, they were mourning the fact that the Messiah has been killed, despite the fact that Jesus said all along, I'm going to be killed. They didn't grasp that. They didn't understand that. But did they go off and kill themselves? Obviously, they weren't guilty, but in terms of in sorrow, well, now it's all over. Israel's all over. There's no chance. I mean, the Messiah, Rome's here to stay, and the kingdom of Israel will never be reestablished, and so forth. They were still thinking along those physical lines as well. But they didn't go off and kill themselves. Judas did. He was racked with guilt. But how much guilt do you think Peter had? How much guilt do you think Paul had? When Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 1, he calls himself the chief of sinners because he persecuted the church. He cast his vote against Christians to be put to death. So, I mean, I understand feeling guilty, feeling remorse, but letting that lead you to do something that even under the old law was sinful. Even under the old law, thou shalt not murder. Well, that's what Judas did. And even under the old law, suicide was considered murder. And so he still did it anyway. And I think that speaks directly, and there's a great application or lesson for us to understand how we handle times where we mess up, whether it's what we would refer to as a tiny mess up. Okay? Maybe there's no ultimate physical major consequences or anything, or a big time mess up, life-changing consequences. It makes no difference. Because, first of all, are there degrees of sin with God? Does God care about a little sin versus a big sin? There's no such thing. Okay, there's only little physical consequence versus big physical consequence in terms of what's going to happen because of this. Well, yeah, Judas betrayed Jesus, but he could have easily, I say easily, he could have taken himself, kind of thought about all the things that Jesus had taught, allowed that remorse turn into repentance, Maybe even seek out the apostles, ask their forgiveness. I can't believe I did this. Maybe even go to the trial and try to catch Jesus' eye in some way, tell him I'm sorry, whatever. He didn't do that. He didn't do that. Thoughts or comments through Judas being remorseful? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and ultimately what you do now with that money is that's your problem. Because even they would have recognized that is blood money. And that was a big deal, that this is blood money. That was directly frowned upon, and you couldn't use, especially if people knew where that money came from, you couldn't use that for just anything. But basically, this is the chief priest saying, they washed their hands of it. Okay, but hey, it's yours, and it's your problem now, what you're going to do with it. Because we're not taking it back. Well, what are we going to do with it? You can't, it's blood money. For all intents and purposes, it's marked. And what are we going to do? Yeah. So this brings up an interesting situation, because there are those who argue that there is a contradiction in the scriptures between Matthew 27, with how Judas dies particularly, and Acts chapter 1. Because in Acts chapter 1, after Peter stands up, Peter is going to recount what took place. And this is, of course, leading to the end that Judas's place as an apostle, that office needs to be filled for right now there are 11, and there need to be 12, and because prophecy is involved, somebody needs to take his place. So Peter stands up in verse 15, and he says, "Men and brethren, this scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit spoke before by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became a guide to those who arrested Jesus." Now, first of all, note that at this point, now granted, it's been probably about 2 months, okay? 30, 40, 60, 57 days and some change, maybe. So about 2 months. Okay, so they know now what Judas did. It's become common knowledge, apparently. And even more than that, I'm sure after Judas killed himself, I'm sure there was, even if whatever the source of their information is, the fact that Judas killed himself certainly would have led to that conclusion anyway. But what we see in verse 16 is that prophecy was involved in regarding knowing what was going to happen to the Messiah, that he would be betrayed. He became a guide to those who arrested Jesus, for he was numbered with us and obtained a part in this ministry. Despite the fact that he betrayed Jesus, and despite whatever hurt that caused the other 11, and I do think that is part of the reason why in every reference to Judas Iscariot, he is always referenced as either the betrayer or the traitor. Every time. In all of the Gospels. And so, again, yeah, that does serve to separate him from the other Judas that isn't Iscariot, the other apostle named Judas. But I think it hurt them that he would do this, which also suggests they didn't probably understand his full character. Over those 3 years, they would have gotten to know each other pretty well. Presumably, Judas was able to hide his worst parts, okay? His vices, I guess you could say, obviously his greed and things like that. And depending on, what his intent was in terms of betraying Jesus, whether he thought he was going to get out of it or whatnot, whatever, in the end, I think this really bothered them. He was one of us. He was a part of this ministry, and he worked in that ministry. What all they were doing, what all he was specifically doing, I don't know, but they were involved in that work. Verse 18. Now, Luke gives us some background here. Okay, so this is Luke writing. "Now this man purchased a field with the wages of iniquity, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his entrails gushed out. And it became known to all those dwelling in Jerusalem, so that field is called in their own language Akeldama, that is, field of blood. There are those who claim that this is a contradiction. Verses 18 and 19, they say, are completely different to the events recorded in Matthew. So either one of them is unaware of the actual events, or both of them. Maybe it wasn't any one of them. And so it kind of throws this doubt into the mind of what actually happened. Well, nobody really knows. Well, first of all, verse 18. Remember what's important about, or one aspect of what's important in Matthew 27 was the fact that there was prophecy involved. That the prophet Jeremiah and the association of, with those funds, a field was bought. So let me ask this question. Do we have instances where when somebody dies, somebody takes their money, maybe it's in trust or maybe it's earmarked for something special, they use it to buy something and then they name it after that person? Okay, in honor of that person, for instance. Okay, such and such field or such and such stadium or whatever, and it was used with their money. In essence, that person financed that stadium or that park or whatever it is. All right? Even though other people may have acted in their stead because they've died, it was their money in their name buying that field. Now, it's interesting to me that what if you have the same thing taking place here in verse 18? That no, Judas didn't personally, physically purchase this field. The priest did it on his behalf with the money he threw in the temple. They picked that field because, remember, he went and he hung himself. Well, he hung himself. What would have explained him hanging himself and what happens in verse 18? He falls headlong and he bursts open and so forth. What would explain both of those? Okay. So if he hung himself and then he died, and remember he's a traitor, so nobody really cares to be associated with him. Let's say I know it's gross, he decays hanging on that rope. Okay. What's going to happen eventually? And he's going to fall, right? Well, suppose that he hung himself and he's hanging himself on a tree that's overlooking this field. When he falls, what's going to happen, especially if it's a height? I mean, and we're not talking a cliff with hundreds and hundreds of feet even, okay? Just maybe 10, 20 feet. What's going to happen if he's already decayed? Okay? Not to get too graphic, but that's what's going to happen. So I suggest to you that when people, they seek for contradictions, instead of seeking, okay, what situation or scenario can explain both of these together? Well, what Luke tells us is that, let's say, he hung himself, and then after he had died, because remember, it doesn't say that he died here, it says falling headlong. Well, he could have already been dead, falling headlong. The rope snapped, or after whatever happened, his body fell, and then when it fell, and especially if it was already decayed, burst open. Okay? Now, those chief priests or whatnot come along, or they hear about the fact that this is what Judas has done. They see this field. So because Judas died in this field, and nobody's going to want that field now anyway, okay, especially being associated with a traitor, they used the 30 pieces of silver, again, which is not a lot. The fact that they could buy any amount of field is significant with 30 pieces of silver, okay? So whoever it was, whoever field this was, they wanted nothing to do with that part of it. So they were willing to get rid of it. And so they bought it in Judas's name, presumably buried the remains of Judas, and then all other strangers they buried there as well. Thus, not only was it a field of blood because Judas died there, but also his blood money was used to purchase it to bury him, and therefore other foreigners and people who couldn't afford anything, maybe even criminals, could be buried there as well. All right. Nolan? Yeah, I think it's the same field because both are called the field of blood in both passages, Mark chapter 27 and in Acts 1.
But where's the connection that says he died in that field? That's what I don't see.
Well, I'm not saying he died in the field. I'm saying his body fell in the field. That's why it became known to all those in Jerusalem, so that field is called in their own language. It could be, verse 19, it could be the field that he purchased. I've always read this as it was the field where his body fell, because that would have made it unclean. That field would have been unclean. And so nobody wanted anything to do with it. And 30 pieces of silver, you can't buy much with 30 pieces of silver anyway. It's possible. It is possible that verse 19, that the field in which was maybe he was buried, or the field that was purchased, called the field of blood. That is possible, yeah. We'll pick up here, and we'll conclude this next week, everybody.